Hello, this time on Sitrep.
The military command and control structures have been agreed for a future multinational force, Ukraine.
The British and French-led military plan to secure Ukraine if and when there is a ceasefire is starting to take shape, but there are still plenty of questions.
I agree we need to be ready for when peace comes. So can he confirm how many other nations will provide fighter jets to the multinational force Ukraine? Can he confirm that there is no longer any planning for a land combat element to the MNFU?
We'll explain what has and what hasn't been detailed and what pieces might yet fit into the gaps of this puzzle. Also on Sitrep, have American nuclear bombs just been stationed on British soil after a 17-year absence? Or does Washington just want it to look that way? And how quantum computing could soon be tracking silent submarines, providing precision navigation without any satellites, or revealing all our secrets to the world.
Sitrep
with James Hirst.
So both Kate and Mike are out this week. Welcome to summer holiday season. I am, though, delighted to be joined by Ed Arnold, sitting in the chair marked Explainer-in-Chief. Ed is a senior research fellow at the defence think tank RUSI and also a former British Army infantry officer. Good to see you again on Sitrep, Ed.
Thanks for having me back.
You, Ed, have been at RUSI, I think it's 4 years now, with a focus on European security. And in my head, in those 4 years, I imagine every conversation you have, everything you write, everything you read, pretty much has ended up having a Ukraine dimension to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not just Ukraine, but the issue is, you can't talk about NATO without Ukraine. You can't really talk around the EU without Ukraine. And actually, the war in Ukraine is not just confined to the borders of that country. Russia is obviously feeling the brunt of it, and at an extended range as well. There was an attack on a Russian airfield 2 years ago in the Arctic Circle. So actually, the war in Ukraine has kinetically come to the Arctic as well, and it's something that is just Ukraine went very quickly from being sort of the periphery to European security. Everyone knew it was a concern, but sort of didn't want to deal with it from a policy perspective. And now it is central to almost everything within European security discussions.
Yeah, it does certainly feel that it is at the centre of every orbit. Now, once again this week, because of that, we are kind of trying to explore a theoretical, but it's one that has become a bit more real in the last few days. The idea of a Ukraine support force to provide it with military backup if or when the fighting is at least paused. This has been talked about a lot over the last few months since President Trump came to the White House and opened his direct talks with President Putin. I think it's just worth, before we talk, listening to, it's about a minute of the Defence Secretary announcing that the command and control structures for such a Ukraine support force have been agreed, because this is pretty much all the detail that we have.
The force's mission will be to strengthen Ukraine's defences on the land, at sea and in the air, because the Ukrainian armed forces are the best deterrents against future Russian aggression. It will include a 3-star multinational command headquarters in Paris, rotating to London after 12 months. And when the force deploys, there will be a coordination HQ in Kyiv, headed by a UK 2-star military officer. It will regenerate land forces by providing logistics, armament and training experts. It will secure Ukraine's skies by using aircraft to deliver levels of support similar to that for NATO's air policing mission. And it will support safer seas by bolstering the Black Sea Task Force with additional specialist teams. When peace comes, we will be ready. When peace comes, we will play our part in securing it for the long term.
I mean, that felt like a pretty big announcement, kind of slipped in under the radar almost. There is a plan. That's a good place to be right now, isn't it?
I mean, yes and no. So in terms of the military, I mean, pre-planning is always useful to a certain extent. The issue surrounding the multinational force Ukraine is it still doesn't have a mission. And all military planning is based on the mission, effectively what you're told to do and why. So without that, it's actually quite difficult. And also within military planning, you can get ahead of yourself. So, there's certain things you can do. So, for example, look at the ground, look at the enemy. And you can start to see where your resources might need to be allocated, what resources you have. But ultimately, that's all pre-planning. And I still think where the multinational force Ukraine is, although it has obviously taken a bit of a leap in the last few weeks, it's about the politics rather than the military. So in terms of force generation, there's around just over 30 nations who are suggesting that they might send forces, but it's very different suggesting and actually committing them. And I think that's the real sort of consideration now. Where is that gap?
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be an element of chicken and egg. What John Healey did say, if I just sort of pull a couple of the phrases that stood out to me, he said that this force will secure Ukraine's skies, and he compared it with NATO's air policing mission, which we've seen in Eastern Europe. He said it would bolster the Black Sea Task Force with additional specialist teams. He was asked specifically whether any planning for a land combat element had been abandoned. But essentially, although he didn't explicitly say it, it sounded to me like basically the coalition of the willing are prepared to put planes in the sky and ships on the sea, but not combat boots on the ground.
Yes, and that seems to be a bit of a shift. So around 4 months ago, there was a lot of talk about boots on the ground deployments, either within training roles or co-located the west of the country. That has seemed to shift, but also I don't necessarily see the sea or air parts of the mission being less dangerous or risky in a certain regard. So, to say that they're securing Ukraine's skies like the Baltic Air Policing mission, the Baltic Air Policing mission and the Icelandic Air Policing mission are NATO missions which cover NATO territory under Article 5 and a political declaration to protect every inch of NATO territory. Ukraine is not a NATO member. And in order to do that effectively in terms of the air, it is still risky. And I always go back to the 22nd of September 2022, when a Russian fighter shot a missile at a UK rivet joint spy plane over the Black Sea. Now, there were 2 points of failure in that, in the sense that the pilot thought he had been commanded to fire, so he fired at the rivet joint, and then also the missile missed. So, go back to that and, probably 45 RAF personnel killed, obviously a large military asset. Then what? And I think this is where really the coalition of the willing needs to look at. They need to look at all of these scenarios to say, okay, well, what does that mean? Because although it's not a NATO mission, it is pulling NATO troops into a broadening conflict.
That said, they have agreed some specific elements of this, and one would imagine that they've thought through those potential scenarios. What John Healey did say is that there would be logistics, armaments, and training experts for Ukraine, and the implication was they would be in country, and a British 2-star led liaison HQ in Kyiv. What would you imagine that liaison HQ be doing?
In terms of that liaison, it would be really looking at the threat that is currently going on within. So, a very dynamic threat and risk assessment as the war materializes. Most analysts assume that even if there is a ceasefire, that ceasefire will be broken periodically. And obviously that would be of great concern to the whole mission. And then really about resourcing and effectiveness. And I think what you said, which is of greatest value probably to Ukraine at the moment, that a lot of this support will be in theatre. Because at the moment for Ukrainians, I mean, they have to come back to, Germany, the UK, etc. for training. That's pretty difficult, pretty time consuming. But also for logistics and maintenance of a variety of equipment, that some of these things, they have to be pushed back to Poland to get fixed to go back into the fight. So actually reducing that logistics lag is probably very, very important for Ukraine, so they can start to build up their forces, start to build up also their offensive potential, because that's ultimately what the deterrence factor is. Not that Ukraine will still be in a war of attrition, but that if the ceasefire is broken, then you're going to see the full force of, a rebuilt and remodeled Ukrainian military.
So, with this sort of partial jigsaw puzzle coming together, what you are saying there is, I suppose, actually the most basic question, which I've forgotten to answer so far. Does this sound like it could make a difference, that it could help keep a peace?
Yes, I think so, but also it's, I think, less about the constructs, the commands, etc. It's more about how the Europeans talk about it. Because if they deploy a mission to Ukraine and operating in a variety of domains, but they're quite timid about it, then Russia's not going to be deterred by that force, and it would possibly be willing to risk sort of minor confrontations with that force to sort of show it as a little hollow. And that's why it has been very important in terms of trying to get some US involvement in, because ultimately that Putin is concerned about the US and that he's worried about for example, the infantry example that I used, if that was a US asset, then he knows that he would be in serious trouble, and that would pull the US in to have far more confrontational stance with Russia. So what the Europeans really need to do to make this a deterrence for its mindset that, this is deploying, and it is deploying for a purpose, which is to deter Russia. This isn't just a sort of small training mission, and also give that political support to Ukraine, because I think at the moment, Putin sort of sees these rhetorical sort of, with Ukraine as long as it takes, as is that true? Can I test that? Can I sort of push it? The Europeans really need to have that mindset deterrence, in the sense that the Russians say, well, no, they are here and they are here for a purpose, and they are going to back it up with credible military force.
You mentioned the fact that American presence would be more of a political deterrent. On a practical level, does it matter that America is not part of the coalition of the willing? And I also wonder, with the puzzle that's taking shape, how big of an ask of this will be for our armed forces, for France's armed forces, for other allies, and whether we've actually got the capacity to sustain it.
Well, I mean, these are all challenging questions, and I suppose, look back at fairly recent operations. So Libya is the prime example, where President Obama famously decided to lead from the back, and they sort of said, well, we're with you initially, but we're pulling away. This is a European mission. That was why it ultimately got a NATO designation. Those were the sort of rules that the US put down. It didn't go very well. In terms of the UK and France, that was difficult, but that was almost a decade and a half ago, and I suppose it is very useful also in terms of that wider deterrence from a NATO perspective, that the UK and France are getting more purposeful operational experience that can then be built on. So I think that is really still important. But I mean, it's not something that can be a learning curve, because we don't necessarily have the time, but this is something that will support. And also, I mean, you can argue it two ways, that this is actually detracting a little bit from NATO's defence and deterrence posture, because headquarters do take a lot in terms of personnel, and the UK and France have other missions within NATO, not least a strategic reserve. But equally, I mean, these forces that are put into Ukraine, if there was a war between NATO and Russia, I mean, they're not going to be neutral. They are going to switch directly to warfighters. So we'll see what the composition, but that's sort of the next question in terms of resourcing. This isn't soft hat sort of, Land Rover type patrolling, etc. Whatever force needs to go in there needs to be a combat force, and they need to be able to switch from a deterrence reassurance force to a combat force very, very quickly, and fix Russians in the south, because that means that they can't mass against the Nordics or the Baltics.
Yeah, and when you sort of say, there's the argument it might take away from NATO's core mission, I mean, it comes back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, everything orbits around Ukraine in terms of, what's been happening in the last 4 years and our planning for the future, isn't it?
Absolutely, and this is sort of the way that I'm looking at it. I mean, they are interlinked, and I think Secretary Healy said that in terms of that, supporting Ukraine in terms of how they are currently sort of at least fixing, but also degrading Russian forces is very important. So these two things are linked, and I think that's the best way of looking at this potential mission. Not that this mission is detracting from NATO's, because ultimately the Nordics, the Baltics, Ukraine, I mean, they're all linked.
Well, let's come to British soil next, and again, something that you can only see as being very heavily influenced by events in Ukraine. We have had some reports in the last few days claiming that American nuclear weapons have just been delivered to the UK after a 17-year absence. Now, we know that the UK is buying planes which could eventually carry these bombs, but those planes are still years away. Yet open source data has shown a US Air Force cargo plane following an itinerary which ended at RAF Lakenheath and which looks like a textbook example of collecting and delivering these nuclear weapons. And a lot of the information for this comes from a transponder on that plane, which could very easily have been switched off. It looks very much like the US wants the world, and perhaps particularly Russia, to see this trip, even though no one will confirm what was or wasn't on that plane. And William Alberk, who is a former director of NATO's Arms Control, Disarmament and WMD Non-Proliferation Centre, believes the evidence here is pretty compelling.
This aircraft is called a C-17A Globemaster. It took off from McChord Air Force Base in Washington State. McChord is home to the unit that's in charge of moving nuclear weapons for the United States. It had a specific call sign which indicated that it was part of a priority mission. It flew to Kirtland Air Force Base, which is in New Mexico. This is the largest nuclear weapons storage facility in the world. The C-17 landed and it went to what we call hot pad number 5. This loading pad is specifically designed, and you can find construction details online, for nuclear weapons loading. The aircraft then takes off, and as it's taking off, you can hear the air traffic control. The pilot says, priority takeoff, hazardous cargo. It then refuels over Newfoundland with 2 Pegasus refueling aircraft in the area. And then it flies on directly to Lakenheath. At the base itself, some tail spotters see the plane. They see a loading equipment, that's MHU-83 loader truck. Again, you can check online. It is certified for nuclear weapons movement. It comes there and it goes to a particular off-ramp, the Victor ramp, which is associated again with hazardous materials. And then the MHU-83 goes to one of the aircraft shelters. We know in these aircraft shelters at Lakenheath Air Force Base, and remember this is RAF Lakenheath, but it is operated by the United States 48th Air Wing, which is home to 2 squadrons of F-15Es and 2 squadrons of F-35As. Both the F-15E and the F-35A are certified for nuclear weapons delivery. They can also fly conventional missions, but they are specifically certified for the nuclear mission. And we know that over the past few years, they have restored the nuclear weapons storage vaults inside the F-35 shelters. So the MHU-83 goes to one of these shelters. Now, is any of this direct evidence that these were nuclear weapons being shipped from the United States to the UK? No. But in the totality of everything that we've seen, is there enough evidence that it would be reasonable to conclude so and difficult to conclude otherwise? Absolutely yes. And coming in the context of everything that's happened with NATO and the US-UK relationship, you would have to say this is an absolute fulfillment of declared NATO policy and US policy. So to me, it looks real.
Very specific steps in there. To you, that looks like a textbook operation to deliver nuclear bombs. With the aircraft transponder on, which is an option they had to turn it off. Absolutely. So they have been absolutely public about every step of this aircraft movement.
Correct. Between the notices to airmen and keeping the transponder on, they didn't have to turn the transponder on at all. They could have done this as a completely secret flight, and we might never have known about it, and maybe tail spotters would have spotted it when it landed at Lakenheath. But the fact that they transpondered it from McCord to Kirtland to Pad 5 to Lakenheath, that's... It's a signal. It's not the loudest signal possible, but the U.S. has a policy called neither confirm nor deny, where they never confirm the presence or absence of nuclear weapons at any one location at any given time. So this is as close as they can come to admitting it.
There is the possibility, it's entirely feasible, that C-17 had no weapons in the cargo hold. That this was a performance to make Russia think that there might be American nuclear bombs in the UK.
Sure, that's possible, but what would be the benefit of that from a strategic point of view? I mean, the UK has its own nuclear weapons, and like I said, we've done more than 40 flights in 2024 of moving B-61s around the bases in Europe. I don't see what putting them or not putting them in, it doesn't change the game, but it does fulfill what looks like a long-standing US and NATO plan to improve their options for deterrence in Europe.
Well, the key word there is deterrence, and that arguably, that strategic ambiguity or that tactical ambiguity is introduced, isn't it? If this was just a performance.
Well, that's true. And like I said, the U.S. policy is neither confirm nor deny. This has been their policy since decades. NCND, as they call it. So they can't confirm that bombs are there. But I think turning the transponder on is both meant to signal to the Russians that this happened, to the expert community that this happened, but also to the NATO allies that this actually did happen. And that's why I think the idea that this didn't happen, there are a lot of NATO allies who would have paid attention to this. And if the U.S. then said, psych, it didn't happen, I think allies would be a little bit confused as to why go to all this elaborate dance just to not do the thing. You know what I mean? In other words, they've paid the strategic cost for doing this. Why not do it?
So, I mean, you ask what the advantage of performing this without actually doing is. To some people, there's a question about what the advantage of bringing those bombs to the UK right now would be, given that this is all politically related to the UK saying it's going to buy F-35As, but we're years away from having those F-35As.
Absolutely true. And I think this movement was planned long before the UK announcement of purchasing the F-35As, because, again, we go back, I think it was 7th of April 2022, I found a DoD document online about their budget for improvement of the U.S. NATO infrastructure, and it's still on the Pentagon website. And it said they were spending $385 million in NATO funds to upgrade infrastructure at nuclear weapon storage, and for the first time ever, it included the UK. So you can go all the way back to April 2022 for when this started. And for that to be in the budget in 2022 means that this was planned as early as 2015. So just to say, it's tempting to tie this to the new F-35 decision by the UK government, but it has been in the works for so much longer than that. These are primarily for the US F-35As. We've even seen online, there was an air show last week, and folks from the US base there were selling a coin, a commemorative coin. This is called a challenge coin that most bases have their own challenge coin. It is in the shape of an atomic blast, and on the other side is a picture of a B-61. So these bombs are intended primarily for the United States, for their F-35s, but also part of how NATO does its nuclear mission is dual-capable certified aircraft, so the aircraft that are certified for the nuclear delivery mission from all these different countries fly to the different bases and pick up bombs. So one of the reasons that they have these here is so that eventually when the UK does have the F-35A, they can fly from Marham Air Force Base, where the F-35s will be based, to Lakenheath to pick up B-61s. But again, the primary mission is for the United States. This is to bolster the US deterrence position in Europe, which I guess, was judged a while ago as not being quite adequate. So they've strengthened their deterrence posture, and in the future, they're ready for the UK. In the meantime, I would expect to see exercises where the UK is flying the other F-35s in just to practice their runs. So that'll be really interesting to watch. You know, how many UK aircraft come in for like touch and go operations at Lakenheath. That would really prove that they're working on interoperability and they're getting the UK ready for the nuclear mission.
William Malbec, it's been fascinating. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Ed, what do you make of this? I mean, it's clear what the US wants this to look like. Have they delivered bombs, or is it a bluff? To your what's your best guess here? Because we are guessing.
Yeah, I mean, I think they have, and I agree with William, and also that this is good preparatory steps. This is probably something that has been in plan for a long time. And it's actually, from, a UK position, it's very consistent with policy. I mean, going back to sort of the 2021 integrated review, which was very interestingly written before Russia's full-scale war in Ukraine, which actually increased the stockpiles of our own warheads in terms of the continuous at-sea deterrence to...
Or increase the upper limit. It didn't...
Increase the upper limit, yes.
Reintroduced ambiguity about how many we'd have.
Yeah, I mean, especially the way that it's had 260 instead of 250. I mean, it showed that there was some analysis behind this, but it was, that, and also the Northwood Declaration between the UK and France on sort of nuclear doctrine in regard to Europe, which was signed 2 weeks ago. I mean, this all shows that there is a broadening and deepening of European and US nuclear posture to provide that deterrent effect to Russia.
Finally, this week, we are all summer long digging into future technologies that could not just give a battle-winning edge, but eventually totally transform warfare. And like guns replace bows and arrows, tanks replaced horses, quantum computing could render our current digital technology obsolete. This isn't computing 2.0. It is a completely different way of working. Here's the science bit. Instead of bits representing 1 and 0, quantum bits in quantum computers can be both 1 and 0 at the same time. Now, even some physicists struggle with explaining this and the rest of quantum mechanics, but the end result is, in a quantum computer, some complex calculations which would take current supercomputers years, some can already be done almost instantaneously, and it will make some of the impossible possible. You could have an entire war played out in battlefield modelling and predictions before it even happens. Perhaps weapons that can calculate exactly what damage they will do and offer options in flight. Unfortunately, it could also render some of our current vital capabilities useless. There have been warnings for years of a so-called quantum apocalypse, whereby encryption would become breakable in seconds rather than the current thousands of years. And this isn't just science fiction. The technology, though, is still very much in its infancy. The Ministry of Defence bought its first quantum computer a couple of years ago, and Nato set up its first quantum lab 6 years ago at its Centre for Maritime Research and Experimentation in Italy. The principal scientist there is João Alves, and he's been explaining what quantum capabilities they are developing and just how much it could transform military operations.
Quantum properties of particles are something that even defies understanding. They totally defy what is intuitive or what our brains can grasp. Quantum computers are a new thing. And there's different types of quantum computers. And even the way you think about the problems, the way you think on the algorithms that will solve the problems is totally different from classical computing. So we are even now trying to find out how to program this quantum computer. So it's a new world unfolding in front of us.
And I can remember, about 10 years ago, a very senior British military officer was asked what keeps him awake at night. And he said it was quantum computing. And that I took to be because quantum computers could break the kind of encryption we're absolutely reliant on now that's seen as, totally unbreakable. Does that mean whoever gets quantum computing working at scale first will have access to everything that everyone else is trying to keep secret?
So that's a very good point. Exactly, because quantum computers can do many of these factorization computations at a much faster rate. So what does this mean? It means indeed that some algorithms could be broken, and there's something that we are witnessing now, which is the store now and decrypt later. So there's actors that are gathering information that they cannot decrypt now in the hope of decrypting it in the future. Even if it's like 5 years old, it may still hold some value. But in the meantime, thankfully, things are moving, and there are new algorithms like quantum cryptography and techniques to use the laws of quantum physics to actually generate quantum ciphers. And there's other things which they don't use the laws of quantum physics, but they are already predicting the power of quantum computers, and therefore they kind of ramping up what would be needed to break them so that quantum computers in the foreseeable future, even them, would not be able to break them. But
so there are systems, classic systems that are already quantum proof, effectively.
Yeah, it's called post-quantum cryptography. So it's something that we are preparing classic systems using classic computers to be ready for quantum computers. Yes. Another perspective in this is something that we here at CMR in La Spezia are working on, is how do we use the quantum laws of physics to generate special cryptographic keys that are unbreakable, in the sense of one of the things that quantum laws offers is this principle of Heisenberg that basically states something to the effect that if you observe something, you will change it by observing it. So by using quantum states of matter to generate cryptographic keys, you would know if there was someone intercepting this key, because by observing it, you would have changed it. So this is unbreakable keys. The technique is called quantum key distribution, which is already used commercially in some applications like banking. And we are now here at CMRE studying means to use it in a defense environment for underwater communication. So things that go through the water, that we use photons to generate these keys that are unbreakable by the laws of physics.
And so would that still need things like fiber optic cables to operate?
That's the interesting thing we are doing. We are basically taking the concepts that currently in the commercial sense use fiber optic cables to free space, so photons that go through the water without any fibers.
How far away is that from being a practical reality?
We currently have some lab proof of concept prototypes, and some of the limitations we have are from a practical nature. So in terms of achievable ranges and the practicality of aligning receiver with transmitter. As you can imagine, if you have free moving bodies in the water, the alignment can become, but those are practical issues that we are tackling. And we expect to have some usable prototypes of this sort of technology in the, let's just say, very near future, without giving too much away.
Just give us a very quick overview of the other kind of things that you're working on to potentially achieve in the future with quantum computing for military applications.
Right. So we are looking at things like how can we improve the methods to determine the propagation of sound in the water, which is basically mathematical models, right? How can this be faster and more effective by using quantum computers? So that's one of the things we're trying to do. Another important topic of research here at CMRE is creating systems that can navigate underwater. So navigating under the water is particularly difficult because there's no GPS underwater, for example. And we typically use things like inertial systems that, just like our phones, are able to identify how they are tilted. They have accelerometers and gyroscopes inside. But once we go into this quantum states of the matter, we're looking at getting this sort of measurements with unprecedented precision. And what it means is that we'll be able to determine in a precise way where a system or a drone underwater is without having to revert to GPS with a very high precision. So the applications, as you can imagine, are fundamental for us because we operate undersea drones, but also for the case where the systems are in potentially GPS usable areas. What we have seen in operational theaters like Ukraine is that GPS can be jammed, GPS can be spoofed, and it fundamentally a system that does not rely on another external system like GPS is a system that is self-sufficient, right? So we are trying to achieve also that, so the self-sufficiency of a system by being able to derive its own navigation, its own positioning without having to depend on an external system.
This is technology that is in its infancy, but beginning to become reality. And we've all seen how technological development can snowball. How transformative to militaries as a whole do you think quantum computing could be? Because, you know, in my head, I have a vision of current technologies perhaps being rendered completely useless within decades.
That's a very fair point. I mean, we recently had, I think it was late last year, U.S. Air Force, if I'm not mistaken, just announced some close to 20% gains in optimization of their logistics just by using a quantum computer to run their logistics optimization. We're talking about big gains. We have civilian applications that will, of course, spill over into the military domain, like computer fluid dynamics to optimize the flow in jet engines, for example. So the likes of Rolls-Royce are spending and investing considerably in that realm. And all of that will spill over into the military domains to have our systems more efficient, better performance, and eventually, for example, the things that we here at CMRE care a lot because we are maritime research and the underwater domain is particularly challenging. This may have a transformative change to us because we have difficulties in knowing exactly where our assets are underwater and being able to communicate securely underwater. There is a big potential for this to change with quantum technologies.
You say eventually. When do you think we will see quantum computing at a scale where it is part of at least some of day-to-day military operations for countries like the UK, the US, or anyone else in NATO?
So within quantum technologies, there are things that are going at different rates of speed in terms of the ability to have them integrated. So running, for example, a quantum computer on board of a drone, that may not happen in the next couple of years. But having a system that can very precisely determine its position based on a quantum sensor on board a drone is something that may happen within a couple of years. Studying these fundamental problems is something that we have been doing here at CMRE since 2019 when we established NATO's first quantum lab, first and sole. So this is the only quantum lab in the alliance, and we study these problems and try to bring them closer to the warfighters. So it's one of the fundamental kind of lines of work that we have here. And many people don't know that basically now all NATO nations, all 32 NATO nations have a quantum lab. So it's here. It's this quantum lab in La Spezia, the only quantum laboratory of NATO.
It sounds like a fascinating place to work. It's certainly been fascinating to talk to you, João. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. João Alves.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
I am a recovering geek. I am fascinated by this stuff. What strikes me talking to João there is, you know, you have these emerging technologies that could be totally game-changing. We're learning new things about the technology we already have in a place like Ukraine, and you're trying to plan for the next generation. It's really hard for our military planners to make the best of and work out what to focus on in terms of now the next step and the bigger future, isn't it?
I think it's a problem that defence planners are certainly recognising. I mean, it was in the Strategic Defence Review a couple of months ago that it was sort of technological adaptation at wartime pace. And I think the real advantage at the moment, again, coming back to the first point, it's all about Ukraine, is like we're also being able to get the data, but not actually being invested in the current fight in terms of personnel like NATO. So I think it's really important. But I think also the word of warning is that this isn't just about defence. I mean, talking about that quantum aspect, we also have to think about hardening non-defensive measures. You know, as an example, I mean, a quantum-enabled cyber attack against the NHS to absolutely cripple its capacity to deal with both military and civilian casualties as a shaping act of a future war, that would arguably be far more a decisive act than some attacks on the military. So we've got to do this as a proper whole of government effort.
And it feels weird to be sat here talking about this about something that just 10 years ago would have sounded like absolute science fiction, something from a James Bond film. And yet this is reality on its way, isn't it?
Yes, and it's, you know, not just in terms of quantum, you know, it's also in terms of AI. Now, there's a lot of hype around AI, but it's certainly, you know, the question at the moment when you're in strategic competition with adversarial states in the world, it's that you have to put money and effort into this, because if you don't and you see the advantage to others, then you're never going to recover. So we're in a critical period of that point. It's, you know, it's not just about sort of having the right technologies. It's about denying other technologies to those states that you're in competition with.
And it's all interlinked, as we were talking about at the start with Ukraine. AI could be turbocharged by quantum computing. Ed, fascinating to get your thoughts. Thank you so much. Really good to see you this week. Thanks to all of our guests. That is all for now. Professor Michael Clark will be back with me for another Sitrep next Thursday. Until then, of course, you can keep up to date with all the latest defence news on our website, forcesnews.com. For now, though, from me, James Hirst, thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.